Alberta and British Columbia sent a joint letter to their provincial counterparts, urging them to support an overhaul of Canada's agreement on internal trade between the provinces. A new agreement would facilitate smoother trade between all the different provinces. And leading this initiative is Saskatchewan's Premier Brad Wall, who we're very fortunate to have now live from our studios in Regina. And Premier Wall, we appreciate your time. Talk to us a little bit about what these trade barriers actually do to impede trade.
Todd, thanks for the opportunity to talk about a new Canada free trade zone. We do have the agreement on internal trade, the AIT, as you've referenced, and there are parts of it, I think, that are working reasonably well, especially around the mobility piece, labor mobility, people's certification being recognized interprovincially, although we could do a little better job on that front too. But we still have unnecessary barriers to interprovincial trade. Sometimes on the procurement side of things, when a provincial government is tendering, for example, for a large project, there might be preferential policies in place for local companies that can in fact drive the cost of those projects and create an unlevel playing field. In fact, it's fair to say that now that we have a free trade agreement with the European Union, that companies in the European Union have freer access to procurement from provinces than some companies in other jurisdictions. We also have unnecessary regulatory barriers, differences, I would say, between the provinces. In the western part of the country, we've agreed to eliminate those so that in transportation, for example, or in energy, it's just easier to do business across the region. So we're hoping that other premiers across the country will accept the opportunity that we now have to negotiate something better than the AIT, a new Canada free trade agreement. We know that free trade's imperfect, but it's better than protectionism in terms of creating jobs and, in the case of government procurement, keeping things affordable for taxpayers. And we'll take this issue to the Western Premiers meeting tomorrow, and then to the Premiers meeting later this summer in Prince Edward Island.
Yeah, it's great to see this initiative on the part of your province and Alberta and BC. I'm curious why there's resistance to this sort of thing in certain quarters. I guess what you might call provincial protectionism rearing its ugly head.
Well, I'm not sure, and frankly, I get a sense when I talk to other premiers that there is a great interest in removing these barriers. And the new Premier of Quebec, I think, has an interest in these kinds of policies that can create economic advantages for us right across the country. So it's important that we talk about it. A few years ago, when premiers really focused on labor mobility, we did make some progress, and there was unanimity there, I think, amongst all the provinces and territories. We need that same unanimity now to come to bear on these trade barriers. You know, a quick example, for example, in Western Canada, in the transportation sector, when you're perhaps operating a trucking company, you can expect the same regime, the same regulations as you go across provincial barriers. It makes it easier to do business. It makes it better for those sending goods and those receiving goods. That's the kind of common sense change we could see right across the country. And I am hopeful that we'll see the same momentum for these changes that we did see a few years ago on the labor mobility question.
Is this something the federal government can help sort of move the ball down the field, or is this something, Premier Wall, that really has to be done by you and your counterparts on an interprovincial level?
It's provincial jurisdiction. It really has to be driven by the premiers. There's one particular issue where the federal government would have to be involved, though, and it's around the issue of wine and beer and spirits. Federal government has legislation that governs the interprovincial transport or sale of these products, and of course in each province we have our own barriers, perhaps, and in Saskatchewan we're looking at reducing those barriers. For example, in the case of BC wine imports to Saskatchewan, we'd also like the same reciprocity, the same treatment for spirits or beer made in Saskatchewan. That would be one example where the feds are needed, but principally the provinces need to drive this, and I'm hopeful that'll be the case in Charlottetown later in August.
And if we could, sort of jump forward into the future, what would you like to see, let's say 10, 15 years down the line here, in terms of how trade operates between provinces here, coast to coast?
Well, I think what we like to see is on the procurement side, when governments are tendering for contracts, that there's a level playing field for businesses, whether they are resident in that province or not. I think, again, that can keep prices low, and it's a fair way to approach it. I hope we can see common sense changes so we have basically the same regulations. By the way, not a race to the bottom. Solid regulations is what we've agreed to in the West, but the same regime across the different jurisdictions so companies can know what to expect. Other common sense changes, for example, in the new West partnership, partnership, the trade agreement governing Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan, we're getting to the point where once you're registered to do business in the province of Saskatchewan, for example, you don't have to take out a business license in another in BC or Alberta. Those are the common sense changes that we can see. We know these create large economic opportunities when we reduce these barriers. Again, free trade is not perfect, but it's better than protectionism. And I think right now we should be exploring every opportunity that exists to improve our economic standing. And yes, we should be pursuing free trade with other countries, but so too should we have freer trade amongst the provinces right here in our own country.
Brad Wall is the Premier of Saskatchewan. Premier Wall, thanks so much for taking time to talk to us and our viewers across the country. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Todd.